It all started aboard a luxury flight to Zurich, in a cabin built for the elite, where silence was polished and privilege came with warm towels and champagne flutes. He stepped on board dressed in precision, calm in his bearing, his skin unmistakably black. His presence met not with welcome, but with suspicion. A simple request for help unraveled into a storm of judgment, triggering whispers, sideways glances, and a chain of cruelty wrapped in the veil of protocol. No one knew who he was. That was the mistake. They saw only what they assumed, acted on what they feared, and tried to erase what they didn't understand. But by the time the flight landed and the truth began to bleed through the lies, it was too late. The damage was done, and the man they tried to humiliate would become the one to decide their future. If you want to know how injustice on a single flight spiraled into a global reckoning, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? What would you have done in Seat 2A? The terminal was alive with the familiar blur of movement. Business travelers pacing in crisp suits, families juggling children and carry-ons, the occasional digital boarding pass flashing on a screen. At Gate 47, Falcon Air's sleek logo glowed above the crowd, announcing the upcoming transatlantic departure. Obadiah Lane stood apart, calm, unmoving. He held a vintage leather briefcase by its worn brass handle, the deep brown catching the light like polished mahogany. His presence was subtle but distinct. A man used to being watched and equally used to pretending not to notice. He wore a perfectly cut charcoal suit, no tie, collar open, the kind of effortless authority people either envied or ignored. When the call for first class echoed over the speaker, he moved without hesitation. No swagger, just deliberate steps as he approached the gate. The agent scanned his pass with a polite nod, no questions, just efficiency. Obadiah walked the jet bridge, his cane clicking faintly beneath him. It was practical, not dramatic, the kind of thing that made people wonder if he was healing from something or hiding something. As he stepped onto the aircraft, a subtle shift occurred. The forward cabin was already half full, voices low, champagne flutes clinking gently. Darla Keene glanced up from her station beside the galley. She was tall, precise, with the kind of blonde bob that stayed in place no matter the weather. Her eyes, a steely blue, locked onto Obadiah instantly. Her face didn't change, but her posture stiffened. Obadiah reached row 2, paused, then lifted his briefcase toward the overhead bin. His shoulder gave a twitch. Pain flared, an old injury, nothing serious, but enough to make him hesitate. Darla approached quickly, not to help, but to control. "Sir," she said with professional tightness, "that case looks quite heavy. Is it full?" Obadiah turned. "Yes, but it meets carry-on limits." She folded her arms. "It doesn't look like it does. It's regulation size and weight. We ask passengers to lift their own luggage. If you're unable to, you may need to check it." "I'm fine," he said, voice even. "Just had a moment." He adjusted his grip, slid the case back down to floor level, and took his seat. Darla didn't move. Her eyes scanned his face, his hands, then the ticket on the armrest screen. She gave a clipped nod and walked away. Obadiah sat quietly, breathing once through his nose. This wasn't new. 20 minutes later, she returned with a tablet. "Mr. Lane," she said smoothly, "I just need to verify your boarding pass again. Protocol." He raised an eyebrow, but complied. She took the phone, examined the digital pass. Her eyes lingered too long. "First class," she said, not as a question, more like a reminder to herself. "Yes." She handed the phone back, then scribbled something onto the tablet. She didn't explain, didn't smile, just left. Around him, passengers glanced sideways. No one said anything. The seat next to him remained empty. As the final passengers boarded, Darla returned again with a cart. She offered drinks across row 1, paused at 2B with a glass of white wine for someone unseen, then skipped 2A entirely. Obadiah watched her serve rows 3 and 4. He pressed the call button. Nothing. She walked by twice more, ignoring him each time. When she finally stopped, it was only because she had to pass the aisle. "Excuse me," he said. "You skipped my drink." "We're out of sparkling water," she replied quickly. I didn't ask for sparkling water. We'll circle back. She didn't. A man in 3A leaned across the aisle. Rough day, he asked with mock sympathy. Obadiah didn't answer. You know, I've been flying this route for 20 years, he said suddenly, loud enough for a few nearby rose to catch. They used to screen first class better. Standards, you know. Obadiah glanced over, but didn't respond. Guess not, the man muttered. His attention returned to his drink. Darla Keene appeared once more, gliding down the aisle with a tray of dessert options. She paused at row 1, then at 2B, offering the man a warm towel and a macaron plate. He accepted it with a flourish. When she turned toward Obadiah, her demeanor cooled instantly. Nothing for you, she asked, tone thinly veiled with challenge. Obadiah looked at the tray. What are the options? Everything's taken, she replied, even though 2 untouched plates remained. Ah, he said. No protest. No sarcasm. Just quiet resignation. Perhaps next time. Of course, she said flatly. She moved on, but not before giving 2B a conspiratorial smile. The man chuckled. They'll let anyone up here now, huh? He said, then cleared his throat as if just talking to himself. Obadiah turned his gaze back to the window, watching the moonlight stripe across the wing. Below them, the Atlantic stretched endlessly, black and indifferent. The humiliation was no longer quiet. It had moved into the open. Across the cabin, a woman in 3B leaned toward her husband and whispered something behind a cupped hand. The husband looked at Obadiah and gave a short nod, agreeing without needing details. Obadiah had become the subject of a silent consensus, an unspoken agreement passed row by row that he did not belong, an intruder in a curated space. At one point, a younger flight attendant, maybe in her 20s, approached with a hesitant expression. She paused beside Obadiah and said, "Sir, is everything all right?" Before he could answer, Darla appeared from the galley. "Tina," she said sharply, "I need you in the back to help with beverage inventory." Tina's mouth opened slightly in protest, but she caught Darla's look and nodded. Of course. She gave Obadiah an apologetic glance and left. The moment didn't go unnoticed. The executive in 2B scoffed and muttered, always needing special attention. "Excuse me." Obadiah asked quietly, eyes still forward. "Nothing," the man said. Didn't say a word. Another passenger, a woman in 4A, shook her head and said under her breath, "This is what happens when people get entitled." The words fell like pebbles, soft, unacknowledged, but heavy. Obadiah felt each one settle into his chest. He leaned slightly and opened the in-flight magazine, pretending to read, using it as a shield. Darla passed again and brushed his shoulder with her elbow, subtle but deliberate. She didn't apologize, just kept walking. Another chime overhead. The captain's voice came through the speaker, soft and routine. Weather updates. Expected arrival. Minor turbulence ahead. Normalcy. As if nothing was happening in plain sight. A short while later, Darla returned to offer passengers hot towels. She handed one to 2B, then skipped to A entirely. Obadiah sat unmoving. His fingers flexed lightly against the magazine spine. His expression didn't shift. But his silence was no longer passive. It was practiced, strategic. When Tina passed by again later, she looked at Obadiah's untouched tray and paused. "Sir, would you like anything?" "I have." "He's fine," Darla interjected from behind. Tina froze. "I just thought he already declined," Darla lied. Tina looked at Obadiah, who met her eyes and gave a slight nod. "It's all right," he said softly. Tina hesitated, then moved on. Darla's smile was tight, triumphant. As she turned to head back to the galley, she glanced toward the cabin camera tucked into the ceiling panel, then back at Obadiah. He followed her gaze. For the first time, she looked uneasy, only for a moment. Then she vanished behind the curtain. The murmurs around him continued, snippets of judgment, condescension disguised as commentary. A man in 3C made a joke about imposters in tailored suits. Someone in 1B laughed too loudly. Obadiah said nothing. He adjusted his cufflink, a small, silver circle engraved with an insignia too obscure for most to recognize. a symbol of his past work, government contracts, oversight boards, international councils. But no one here saw that. They saw only what they chose to see. As the flight rolled into its fifth hour, the cabin darkened. Personal lights flickered on as some passengers read, others dozed. Obadiah remained upright, still, eyes half closed. Not sleeping, just watching, waiting. A hand on his shoulder startled him. He turned. It was Darla. "Sir," she said in a low voice, "you're going to need to cooperate." "With what?" he asked. "There have been concerns from passengers. You've been making others uncomfortable." His jacket was off, sleeves rolled, posture relaxed, as if this cabin had reverted to some private club where the rules no longer applied. Darla had returned twice in the last hour, but only to deliver whispered threats disguised as procedural checks. Each time she came, she loomed a little longer, stood a little closer, always with a sideways glance that dared Obadiah to step out of line. The air around her was colder now, like a cloud of malice that moved with her. She didn't just want compliance anymore, she wanted submission. At 2:13 a.m., with most passengers either asleep or wearing noise-canceling headphones, she returned with purpose. No tray, no clipboard, just a tight smile and a narrowed gaze. She stood beside him, arms crossed. "Mr. Lane," she said, voice low and sharp, "there's been a report of inappropriate behavior." Obadiah blinked. "From whom?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. "Several passengers. Comments. Unsettling presence. We take such reports seriously." "I haven't spoken to anyone," he said evenly. "Doesn't mean you haven't made others uncomfortable," she replied, louder this time. A few heads turned. "What exactly is the allegation?" he asked. "You've been watching female passengers, making them uneasy. We need to address it." Obadiah stared at her, unblinking. "That's not true. We'll need to move you," she said, "to a seat where you'll be less of a disruption." "I haven't disrupted anything," he said calmly. "Sir, I'm not asking," she snapped. Behind her, Tina appeared, eyes wide, clearly unsure whether to intervene. Obadiah looked past Darla, locking eyes with the younger attendant. Tina hesitated, then turned away. The next few moments happened in slow motion. Darla leaned forward and grabbed Obadiah's tray table latch. With a practiced motion, she yanked it forward, making a loud clack that startled passengers in row 3. "Please stand," she said, as if addressing a criminal. "Where are you moving me?" Obadiah asked. "Rear of the aircraft. You'll be more comfortable there," she said. "This is not about comfort," he said. "It's retaliation." Darla didn't respond. 2 other flight attendants approached. One male, one female. They stood behind her like enforcers, silent, present. "Sir," the male attendant said, "let's avoid escalation." Obadiah rose slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't resist. But each step he took toward the back of the plane felt like a crack forming underfoot. Row after row of passengers watched as he walked past, escorted like a threat. Some looked away in shame, others stared openly. At row 17, the man in 14 muttered, "About time." In 18C, a woman clutched her purse closer. In 22B, a teenager held up her phone and filmed. They seated him near the lavatory in an aisle seat that didn't recline. The cushion was thinner, the air colder. The briefcase had been brought back by Tina, who placed it carefully on the floor beside him. She didn't speak. Her eyes said everything. A minute later, Darla returned with a crumpled blanket and a plastic cup of water. "Here," she said, tossing the blanket onto his lap. The water sloshed onto his trousers. She didn't apologize, just turned and walked away. Obadiah dabbed at the spill with the edge of the blanket, then folded it across his legs. He looked down the aisle toward the front cabin, which now felt like a different planet. The degradation was no longer subtle. It was deliberate. It was public. And it was escalating. His relocation wasn't procedural, it was punitive. The lie about making passengers uncomfortable was strategic, designed to frame him as the problem while shielding Darla from scrutiny. She didn't want him gone. She wanted him diminished. He knew this kind of tactic. He'd seen it deployed in corporate meetings, on investment boards, during city planning committees. Manufactured justification. Public narrative, private cruelty, but never had it been this personal, this raw. He had been reduced from a composed, first-class passenger to a disruptive, silent exile. And through it all, he remained calm, not because he was weak, but because he understood power. The power of patience, the power of perception, the power of truth. He let the indignity settle around him like fog. Let the whispers float through the cabin. Let the false narrative take shape. Because he knew it would not last. The curtain had been pulled tight. The audience believed the villain was him. But the script hadn't reached the climax yet. Around him, the passengers were a mix of sleeping bodies, tired murmurs, and hushed music filtering through cheap earbuds. No one greeted him. No one offered a glance of empathy. To them, he was already framed, moved from first class not by mistake or circumstance, but because he was trouble. The whispers had followed him down the aisle, and now, here in the back, they lingered like smoke. He didn't sleep, couldn't. Every second of the past few hours played on a loop in his mind. The accusations, the glares, the cruel remarks masked as small talk. Darla's lies hadn't just tarnished his moment. They had rewritten his entire presence aboard this aircraft. Each crew member that passed him now did so with a polite avoidance, their gazes skimming over him as if his seat were empty. It was the kind of erasure born not from accident, but design. He was being erased not for who he was, but for who he refused to be in their narrative. A compliant threat, a silent disruption, a black man who wouldn't shrink when told. The turbulence started around 3:45 a.m. Nothing violent, just the kind that stirred cups and triggered seatbelt signs. But it gave Darla an excuse. She moved through the cabin, checking belts, her eyes scanning rows for noncompliance. When she reached 28D, she paused. "Buckle up, sir," she said curtly, even though Obadiah's belt was already fastened. "It is," he said, lifting his hands. "Now it is," she replied without checking. A man across the aisle laughed softly. "Some people just can't follow rules," he whispered to his seatmate. Obadiah heard. Darla did too. She smiled, the kind that didn't warm her face. "Let's all try to make this easy," she added to the row, before stepping away. Minutes later, the turbulence passed. The captain's voice reassured the passengers. But calm didn't return for Obadiah. Darla reappeared, not alone this time. The male attendant who had escorted him earlier followed her, holding a slim black device, a tablet. She crouched slightly at Obadiah's side, not to whisper, but to be heard. "Sir," she said, louder than necessary, "we've received an alert from the FAA about your presence." Obadiah frowned. "What kind of alert?" he asked. "We've been asked to verify your identity," she said. "Security protocol." "On a flight already in the air?" "We follow procedures when we're notified," she said smoothly. "Please provide identification." He reached into his jacket pocket slowly, deliberately, and handed her his passport and boarding pass. She took them without thanks, scanned both with the tablet. Her brows furrowed. "Obadiah Lane," she said slowly, as if testing the name for fault. "This says first class." "That's correct," he said. "Then why are you back here?" she asked loudly, turning toward the rows now watching. Obadiah stared at her. "Because you put me here." "I don't assign seating," she said flatly, then turned back to the attendant. "Mark it," she instructed. The man tapped the tablet. "Possible ID discrepancy," she added for effect, before handing the documents back. "You'll need to remain seated until we land. Security will be waiting." "Security for what?" Obadiah asked. "Just stay calm," she said, then walked away, satisfied. The passengers around him shifted, fidgeted. No one asked him if he was all right. No one asked for context. He was now not only isolated, he was criminalized. A flight risk. A problem to be contained. The old man in 29, quietly unbuckled and leaned away. The mother in 27, clutched her purse tighter. The narrative was complete. Darla had manufactured it expertly. A black man gets moved from first class for disruptive behavior, then flagged for identity concerns mid-flight. Every passenger who had witnessed his dignity stripped now had a reason to justify it. Obadiah Lane had become what Darla needed him to be: wrong, untrustworthy, dangerous. The hours dragged on. When breakfast service began, he was the last to receive a tray. A dry bagel, a sealed cup of orange juice, and no cutlery. "Eat with your hands," the passing attendant said without stopping. Obadiah looked at the tray, then set it aside. He wouldn't eat, not because of pride, but because hunger was easier to bear than submission. As the cabin stirred with renewed energy, he remained still, face expressionless, eyes burning beneath the surface. The humiliation had evolved. It was now complete. Then came the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice said calmly, "we'll be landing shortly. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Obadiah glanced at the window. Zurich below looked peaceful, untouched. The mountains in the distance rose like guardians. He'd been looking forward to this trip, a quiet retreat before the whirlwind of his upcoming meetings, a final breath before weeks of high-stakes negotiations. Now, he would land not as a traveler, but as a suspect. As the wheels touched the tarmac, a jolt ran through him, not from a landing, but from the realization that the abuse hadn't ended. It had just gone airborne. Darla approached once more as passengers prepared to disembark. She leaned close, her voice lower this time. "Just wait here when we land. Someone will come for you. Cooperate and it'll be fine." Obadiah looked up at her. For the first time, his face changed. Not anger, not fear, just clarity. He saw her clearly now, not a professional, not a servant of protocol, but a coward dressed in authority. The plane rolled to a stop. Doors opened. Passengers filed out. Many cast glances back at 28D. Some smirked. Others pretended not to see. When only a few remained, two uniformed airport officers boarded. They walked directly to him. "Mr. Lane?" one asked. Obadiah nodded. "Please come with us." No cuffs. No questions. Just escort. A public performance. He stood slowly, straightened his jacket, picked up the briefcase, and walked toward the exit. As they passed through the frosted glass doors into a sterile corridor lined with security monitors and neutral expressions, he was led toward a private inspection room tucked behind customs. The door closed behind him with a soft click, locking out the distant hum of travelers and the scraping of luggage wheels. Inside, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and an impeccable suit waited with a tablet and a half-finished cup of coffee. Next to him stood a younger woman, expression blank, arms folded. "Mr. Lane," the man began, not unkindly, "there seems to be a discrepancy regarding your travel profile." Obadiah's voice remained calm. "Discrepancy how?" The flight crew reported irregularities, identity concerns, behavioral red flags, and a failure to comply with crew directives. "I see," Obadiah replied. "And what proof do they have?" The man glanced down at the tablet. "We've reviewed the flight report submitted digitally by lead attendant Darla Keene. It's comprehensive, includes timestamps, crew witness confirmations, and a note about potential falsified credentials." "My credentials are real," Obadiah said. "So is my identity." "I'm not accusing you," the man said quickly, "but we're obligated to investigate. It's standard when this type of report is filed mid-air." She submitted the report before landing. Obadiah noted. "Correct. Without speaking to me. Without requesting confirmation from me. Without evidence." The man didn't respond immediately. The woman stepped forward and placed a small folder on the table. Inside were printed screenshots of the flight manifest, Obadiah's digital boarding pass, and several pages of Darla's incident report. Obadiah read each word with growing disbelief. It wasn't just false, it was orchestrated. According to the report, he had verbally harassed crew members, intimidated a young flight attendant, and refused multiple requests to return to his assigned seat in coach. The boarding pass photo was cropped, barely showing the seat assignment. His demeanor was described as volatile, his presence threatening to passenger comfort. He looked up. "This is fiction." The woman didn't answer. The man shifted in his seat. "We'll verify all details, of course. There are procedures to follow." "What about the security footage from the cabin?" Obadiah asked. Surely the plane's cameras captured something. The man hesitated. "Unfortunately, the cabin footage appears to be corrupted." We received a technical error notification during download. How convenient, Obadiah murmured. The woman finally spoke. There was also a passenger statement corroborating the attendant's report. Which passenger? He asked. Confidential, she replied. We can't disclose identities during an open review. So let me understand, Obadiah said. A single flight attendant with a personal vendetta fabricates a report. The footage that could disprove it disappears, and an anonymous witness supports the lie. And that's enough to drag me into detainment. The man raised a hand, calming. We're not detaining you. We're clarifying facts. You're not under arrest. Then I'm free to leave? Obadiah asked. Silence stretched. We recommend cooperation, Mr. Lane. It will expedite the process. He stood slowly. I've cooperated enough. The woman blocked the door. Please sit. Obadiah didn't move. For the first time in hours, something shifted behind his eyes. Not defiance, not aggression, just a quiet calculation. He sat down again, not because they told him to, but because he chose to. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know what they were doing. Yet, back on the Falconair aircraft, now parked at the gate, Darla sat in the empty galley, sipping tea and reviewing her report. She smiled to herself as she reread the words she typed, each sentence constructed with legal ambiguity and professional distance. Enough detail to imply threat, but none to trigger lawsuit. Enough caution to cast doubt, but never outright slander. It was an art, really, painting a target with words. And she had done it masterfully. She had even coached another attendant, the timid one, Tina, into signing off on a supporting comment, suggesting that Obadiah had behaved unusually during service. Tina hadn't wanted to sign it, but Darla had reminded her that jobs were scarce and records were permanent. Tina had signed. Regretfully, Darla closed her tablet and stood. She had done what was necessary. No one had gotten hurt. The plane had landed. The threat had been neutralized. That was her job, after all. Maintain order, protect passengers, and above all, remind everyone where the lines were. But Tina, still lingering at the back of the plane as the cleaning crew moved in, sat motionless. The weight of her signature burned in her mind. She knew the report was false. She had seen everything. Obadiah had said barely a word the entire flight. His only crime had been existing where others thought he didn't belong. She stared at the empty seat where he had been relocated, the crumpled blanket, the untouched tray, the cup of water that had spilled across his lap. Her stomach churned. She knew she had helped bury the truth. Meanwhile, in Zurich's customs wing, Obadiah finally stood again. The interrogation had ended. No apology, no explanation, just a polite nod and a vague assurance that everything would be reviewed internally. They returned his passport, handed him a clearance form, and opened the door. He stepped out into the concourse, the lights bright, the air open. But the freedom felt artificial. The stain of accusation still clung to him. His phone buzzed. A message from his assistant. Zurich conference rescheduled. Board meeting in 6 hours. Logistics secure. Let us know your status. Obadiah typed back one word. Proceed. The false report, the corrupted footage, the so-called witness, every part of the carefully fabricated incident had been orchestrated to cast doubt on his integrity, reduce his presence to a security concern, and turn the reality of discrimination into a mere misunderstanding to be logged, reviewed, and forgotten by officials who had no intention of doing anything beyond protecting their system. His hotel car arrived on time. The driver greeted him politely, opening the rear door of a black Mercedes sedan, oblivious to the drama unfolding behind corporate curtains. Obadiah climbed in without speaking. He leaned back, his mind not on the Swiss skyline, not on the precision of Zurich traffic, but on the complete disintegration of his dignity. This wasn't about ego. It wasn't about bruised pride. It was about the kind of erasure that seeps into perception, the subtle reframing of a man into a threat, the complete redefinition of identity through the false lens of accusation. The events on that flight hadn't just pushed him to the back of the plane. They had pushed him out of his own narrative and into one constructed by fear, bigotry, and systemic protectionism. He arrived at the hotel, checked in without a word, and was escorted to a top-floor suite overlooking Lake Zurich. He didn't notice the view. He walked straight to the desk, opened his briefcase, and activated a secure device tucked into the interior lining. A small light blinked green. He placed his palm flat on the scanner and waited. The screen lit up. Connection verified. A single message appeared. Protocol authorized. Report log transmission ready. Obadiah didn't smile. He didn't allow himself even the shadow of satisfaction. What Darla and her superiors didn't know, what those who orchestrated his public degradation didn't understand, was that he had anticipated this exact kind of outcome. Not the specifics. No one could have predicted Darla's exact cruelty, but the architecture of it. The way systems react to people like him who walk through doors they weren't expected to enter. While he prepared the transmission across the Atlantic in New York, a junior operations coordinator named Tessa James sat at her desk inside Falcon Jet's East Coast headquarters. She had just opened an email marked Priority 1. Subject line, Preliminary Incident Report Review, Flight 379 Zurich. Attached was a copy of Darla Keene's report and internal notes from Zurich Airport Security. Tessa was no executive, but she had clearance to catalog such reports for the company's legal and media response teams. As she scrolled through the documents, a tight knot formed in her stomach. Something was off. The language in the report read like a script, too polished, too vague. And when she checked the camera footage log from the Falcon Air security server, she saw a familiar warning. Video file error. Tampered source detected. Tessa's eyes narrowed. She knew what that meant. The footage hadn't just failed. It had been altered. Someone had accessed the file before it was archived. That required an override password. Someone high up. Back in Zurich, Obadiah completed the upload. His secure transmission included time-stamped footage captured through his smartwatch, which had recorded audio for most of the flight, including Darla's tone, her threats, the comments made by other passengers, and his own complete lack of aggression. The recordings were clear. The degradation undeniable. He sent the file to 4 separate addresses, one to his legal team, one to his foundation's ethics division, one to his private government liaison, and one directly to the Defense Oversight Committee. Falcon Jet was not a commercial airline alone. It was also the primary bidder for a $2.6 billion aviation contract linked to Obadiah's advisory board. The same board that now had in its possession the complete breakdown of what happened on Flight 379. At that same moment, Darla Keene returned to her apartment in Queens. She poured herself a glass of white wine and sat on her leather couch, flipping through TV channels without really watching. Her phone buzzed. A message from her supervisor. Good job on the Zurich situation. Legal's happy with the documentation. Let's close this before the press hears anything. She smiled. Another problem neutralized. Another shift completed without incident. But the next message hit harder. Emergency meeting. Falcon Jet Review Board. All Zurich crew. Tomorrow, 8 a.m. Her smile faded. She reread it. Then again. Emergency meetings weren't standard. Not after a closed report. In Zurich, Obadiah sat by the window, finally gazing out at the shimmering lights on the water. He had done what he could without confrontation. He had preserved his voice until it mattered. And now, as the silence deepened, he felt something return. Not pride, not vengeance, but clarity. He had spent the last 24 hours being stripped, silenced, and pushed down. But now the tide had turned. The weight wasn't gone, but it was no longer his alone to carry. The evidence lived outside of him now, beyond denial. He had kept his voice low, his posture calm, his resistance internal. But the time for silence was ending. While the world had attempted to reduce him to a passenger in a wrong seat, a threat on a flight, or a problem to be contained, it had overlooked the truth. Obadiah Lane was not only a man of considerable reputation. He was the executive chairman of the United States Aviation Oversight Council, the principal advisor on military-civilian aerospace development contracts and procurement, a man whose direct recommendations influenced the signing or cancellation of contracts worth billions. including the current $2.6 billion bid FalconJet had pinned its future on. The very company that had empowered Darla Keene's unchecked aggression, the airline whose upper management had processed a report without question, was the same one now facing the risk of collapse, and they had no idea that the man they tried to humiliate held that level of power. As he stepped away from the window, his phone rang. It was the head of the Zurich delegation, Lucas Friedman, a Swiss logistics executive and primary liaison to the NATO-aligned Infrastructure Commission. "Mr. Lane," Lucas said, breath short, "we've received word. There's been a formal withdrawal of FalconJet's bid from the Defense Committee docket, effective immediately. They haven't made a public statement yet, but we're seeing signs of internal panic." Obadiah's voice was even. "That decision was not made lightly. Was it your doing?" Lucas asked, almost in awe. Obadiah said nothing, which was answer enough. Lucas continued, "The committee will want a new recommendation. Should we delay the session?" "No," Obadiah said. "Proceed as planned." While the international market scrambled to decipher the implications of FalconJet's sudden removal from consideration, Darla Keene sat rigid in the HR conference room of Falcon Air's Manhattan headquarters, the walls lined with corporate slogans and framed images of aircraft in sunset flight. She hadn't spoken since entering the room. A legal advisor sat beside her, flipping through a binder, and across the table were two senior executives, neither smiling. Her supervisor sat at the end, eyes unreadable. "Miss Keene," the senior director began, "we've received new evidence contradicting your account of Flight 379. Audio recordings, time logs, and third-party witness statements. Would you like to amend your report before this proceeds to federal review?" Darla swallowed. "Those recordings were manipulated." "We disagree," the director said. "The file has been authenticated and submitted through official Department of Transportation channels. Do you know who Mr. Lane is?" She hesitated. "He's a businessman. He's a federal advisor," the director said flatly. "His recommendations influence contracts we spent 5 years preparing. His seat in first class was purchased under diplomatic authorization. That information was in the system. You bypassed it. You falsified your report." Darla's face drained of color. "No one told me who he was." "That's the point," the director said coldly. "You weren't supposed to need to know. Your conduct wasn't just discriminatory, it was criminally negligent." In Zurich, Obadiah entered the conference hall dressed in a navy suit, tailored and deliberate, the kind of garment worn by someone who intended to be seen clearly and without apology. The room was filled with dignitaries, corporate leaders, and military advisors, each flipping through updated briefing packets that had just landed in their email. A full breakdown of the Flight 379 incident, the disciplinary notes against FalconJet's Zurich crew, and the implications of falsified passenger misconduct reports. None of the attendees spoke about it openly, but the tension was palpable. When Obadiah took his seat at the head of the table, the room stilled. What followed was a precise presentation, devoid of dramatics, filled with hard data, revised bids, and logistics reassessments. When it was over, no one asked what happened on the flight. No one needed to. His presence, once questioned and degraded in a cabin of strangers, now commanded absolute deference. News began to spread. Media outlets, first cautious, then emboldened by anonymous sources, reported on a mysterious incident involving a senior U.S. official mistreated aboard a Falcon Air international flight. An internal whistleblower, Tessa James, leaked confirmation of video tampering and pressured staff reports. The words racial profiling, corporate negligence, and federal fallout began trending online. Obadiah gave no interviews, released no statements. He didn't need to. His silence had already become louder than outrage. Back in New York, Tina sat at her apartment desk, staring at the resignation letter she had just typed. She had been offered immunity in exchange for a formal statement confirming Darla's coercion, and she had agreed. But it didn't erase her guilt. She would leave the airline, but she wouldn't walk away from what she had allowed. Her statement had helped stop a lie from becoming permanent, but the truth had taken too long to arrive. Obadiah Lane returned to his suite after the conference, his body tired, but his mind clear. For the first time since the journey began, He allowed himself to breathe without weight on his chest. He had revealed nothing during the worst hours, not his title, not his influence, not his reach. He had given Darla and her peers every opportunity to be decent, to reverse course, to step back from the edge of cruelty. Inside were the authenticated transcripts, audio recordings, and internal documentation from Flight 379, submitted through both civilian and military channels by Obadiah Lane's counsel. Unlike most cases that passed through this committee, this one was not about procurement strategies or logistics reviews. This one was about power, how it was misused, how it was hidden, and how it was misjudged. The committee chairman cleared his throat and said plainly, "This matter is no longer limited to aviation policy. It's a federal breach of ethical and legal standards." As they prepared to review the disciplinary actions pending against FalconJet, Falcon Air, and associated personnel, one thing had already been made clear: the public fallout was just beginning. Meanwhile, Obadiah Lane walked into the tall glass headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense Procurement Review Board. His arrival was unannounced. It didn't need to be. The guard at the door recognized him instantly and opened the security gate without pause. No identification requested. No explanation needed. Inside, analysts glanced up from their screens. Staffers lowered their voices. And within seconds, the office atmosphere shifted. He wasn't just a senior advisor anymore. He was now the man who had quietly dismantled the corporation's billion-dollar defense bid without a press conference, without a press release, and without retaliation. His power had always been discreet. Now it was undeniable. In New York, Darla Keene sat across from a federal mediator in a white-walled office where no corporate slogans lined the walls, no marketing photos softened the atmosphere. She wore a plain blazer, her usual commanding expression replaced by visible discomfort. The mediator opened a folder. "You're aware the Department of Transportation has launched a full investigation into your conduct and the chain of events following Flight 379. Darla nodded slowly. "You're also aware your conduct, as described in the official complaint, includes willful misrepresentation, discrimination, and obstruction of truth." "I didn't know who he was," she said weakly. "That's irrelevant," the mediator replied. "He didn't need to be anyone for your behavior to be reprehensible. That he is someone only makes it worse. It means you lied, abused your position, and jeopardized your employer's federal contract while targeting a federal advisor." Darla's hands trembled. Her legal counsel whispered something to her, but she didn't hear it. She could only hear her heart pounding. She had believed herself untouchable. She had believed that procedure and habit would protect her. She had believed that silence would be his end. She had been wrong. Back at the hotel in Zurich, Obadiah received a call from the Federal Communications Commission liaison assigned to the aviation inquiry. The voice on the line was formal but respectful. "Mr. Lane, I wanted to inform you that the FAA, in coordination with our office, has confirmed falsified reports and technical tampering with flight security systems on Flight 379. FalconJet's executive team has been called to submit formal statements under oath. We'd like to extend an offer for you to speak at the upcoming National Aviation Ethics Symposium next month." Obadiah responded with the same restraint he had used when speaking to Darla's superiors. "I will consider it. But let me be clear, this was not a one-time incident. It is systemic. Speaking won't change it. Reform might." The liaison paused. "Understood, sir. We're reviewing changes now." Meanwhile, media outlets across the U.S. and Europe now carried headlines that read like thunderclaps. "Federal advisor mistreated on international flight. False report exposed. $2.6 billion defense deal collapses amid scandal. Flight attendant faces discrimination charges after truth surfaces." Photos of Obadiah exiting the Zurich conference began circulating, always captured with precision, his presence calm, his stride deliberate. Commentators noted how he never once spoke to the press, never once responded to the swirling speculation. He didn't need to. His silence had become a symbol, a contrast to the noise that surrounded the company's scrambling to explain their failure. At Falcon Air's main office, CEO Robert Lawton sat with his legal team in the boardroom where, for months, The company had prepared its case for the defense contract. Now those preparations were being used to evaluate the scope of the internal collapse. "We didn't know," one executive said. "We trusted the crew. We trusted Darla." "You didn't verify anything," Robert snapped. "You approved a Madare report against a high-level government official without confirming a single detail. That kind of mistake costs empires." A lawyer placed a report on the table. "Sir, we're receiving early indicators that the Department of Justice may pursue charges if we can't demonstrate immediate and transparent accountability. The damage control window is closing fast." In the quiet of his suite, Obadiah finally allowed himself a long moment to sit at the edge of the bed and breathe. Not because the battle was over, but because the storm had finally shifted direction. He had never raised his voice, never revealed his rank. But now, his identity had become a mirror. Those who had looked down on him, spoken over him, dismissed and displaced him, now had to look back into that mirror and see their own reflection. The reflection of their prejudice, their cowardice, their need to control what they could not understand. In that mirror, he wasn't the one undone. They were. What had begun as a routine review had become a spiral of accelerating damage, and at the center of it all stood the one incident no one had taken seriously when it first crossed the desk: Flight 379. The fallout was no longer speculative. Federal subpoenas had been issued. Depositions were scheduled. Public confidence in the Falcon Jet brand had cratered overnight. Military publications were now publishing scathing critiques of Falcon Jet's executive culture, accusing them of creating an environment where bias flourished, where frontline decisions were made without accountability, and where legal manipulation was used to silence rather than clarify. The $2.6 billion defense deal that had once promised legacy-defining contracts was now a black mark on the company's reputation. Their name was being scrubbed from federal procurement databases, not paused, but flagged, red tagged for internal misconduct and regulatory failure. They were being blacklisted not because of a technical error, not due to a product flaw, but because one of their employees decided a man in seat 2A didn't belong there, and every level of management chose not to question her. Darla Keene stood inside a government office in downtown D.C., her expression hollow, eyes distant as she listened to the terms of her legal review. She wasn't in handcuffs, but she wasn't free either. Her actions had triggered a chain of violations that could now lead to both civil liability and criminal charges under federal aviation law. The Department of Transportation's Civil Rights Division had issued a formal statement calling her conduct discriminatory and abusive of professional protocol. The Department of Justice was still building their review, but the language had shifted. Where once she had been described as an employee under investigation, she was now being called the initiating agent of unlawful conduct. Her union representatives sat beside her, tense and silent, the pages of the investigation too damning to dispute. The manipulated flight report, the falsified witness support, the intentional omission of video evidence, all confirmed. Obadiah Lane's audio recordings had provided not just evidence of her behavior, but of her intent, clear, unmistakable malice masked as professionalism. Her attempt to strip a man of dignity and reposition him as a disruptive threat was no longer seen as a personnel matter. It was systemic sabotage, weaponized from a position of authority, executed against a federal advisor in active capacity. Her suspension was immediate. Her license revoked pending further trial. Every application she would ever make for another flight-related job would carry this case in its footnotes, etched into her career like a scar. Elsewhere, the executive board of Falcon Jet met in a tense, closed-door emergency session. No press was allowed, no cameras, but statements were being prepared for release, even as they deliberated over resignations. Their chief operating officer had already stepped down, citing personal reasons. The head of international compliance had been placed on indefinite leave. Internal investigators reported multiple documented complaints from minority passengers over the last 2 years that had never reached legal review. A culture of silence, cloaked in bureaucracy, now exposed. Shareholder meetings were postponed, then canceled. Partner companies requested re-evaluations of collaborative projects. FalconJet's European partner threatened to dissolve their merger unless sweeping personnel changes were made. For the first time in decades, the company faced genuine existential risk. And all because the man in 2A chose not to respond with anger. All because the man they tried to humiliate had something far stronger than rage. He had truth. In Zurich, Obadiah Lane attended the final day of the International Infrastructure Conference, this time not as a keynote observer, but as the surprise guest of honor. The announcement came without fanfare, delivered by a senior official who simply said, "Some voices carry more than weight. They carry example." The audience stood as he took the stage. He spoke only briefly, his words measured, his tone unwavering. "We don't always choose the moments where our character is tested," he said, "but we do choose how we respond." What happened aboard Flight 379 was not unique. It was familiar. It was repeated. And it will continue to happen unless we confront not just the acts, but the systems that protect them. His words were not explosive. They were grounding. And because of that, they traveled farther. That same day, Tina, the junior flight attendant who had initially complied with Darla's request to submit a false report, met with federal investigators. Her statement confirmed what Obadiah's recordings revealed. Her voice trembled as she described the pressure she had felt, the threat to her job, the way Darla had twisted professionalism into punishment. But her cooperation mattered. It became a bridge for accountability. The authorities didn't see her as a villain. They saw her as a key to stopping the rot. Her testimony helped push the case toward conclusion. She wasn't offered reinstatement. She didn't ask for it. She wanted to step away from aviation entirely, but now she did so with her name cleared. Back in New York, social media had shifted. What began as whispers and speculation had become a wave of commentary and examination. Activists praised Obadiah's restraint. Legal experts dissected the implications of his treatment. Corporate watchdogs used FalconJet as a case study in how not to handle discrimination. One headline from a prominent national outlet read, "The Price of Silence: How Ignoring Racism Cost FalconJet Everything." Another simply said, "He never raised his voice. He didn't have to." Obadiah himself remained unavailable for interviews. He gave no statement. His silence continued to be louder than noise. In Washington, the Federal Aviation Administration issued a new directive requiring mandatory third-party review of in-flight misconduct reports involving marginalized passengers. The Obadiah Lane Protocol, as it was being informally called within policy circles, would soon become formal regulation. It wasn't about his name. It was about what his experience proved. That without oversight, bias flourished. That without accountability, cruelty repeated. In a quiet moment alone, Obadiah stood again before a window, this time not in Zurich, but in his Georgetown townhouse, the city skyline in the distance. He had received a final message that morning. The letter was from Darla, not sent through a lawyer, not crafted by PR, just words written by a woman no longer protected by illusion. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't plead for sympathy. She admitted what she had done, not just on that flight, but in the years before, in the unchecked assumptions, the casual disdain, the moments where she had decided someone didn't belong based on nothing more than appearance. It began not with another press release, not with a public apology or sweeping policy overhaul, but with a letter, handwritten, mailed quietly, not from a lawyer, not stamped with any company's insignia. The paper was thick and folded with care, its penmanship uneven but sincere. Obadiah Lane received it 3 weeks after the federal reviews concluded, after the media frenzy quieted and the public moved on to other scandals, other crises. But he had not moved on. He hadn't pursued vengeance, hadn't filed suit, hadn't demanded compensation. He had simply done what needed to be done. He exposed the truth, let accountability run its course, and then stepped back into the silence he trusted more than applause. The letter, postmarked Queens, New York, came from Darla Keene. In it, she described, in stumbling words and unfiltered confessions, the process of facing herself without the buffer of authority. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not deflect. She simply said she had begun to understand what she had become, not just what she had done. She admitted that she had spent years policing who belonged where, weaponizing the small powers of her role to exclude, to judge, to remind others of invisible lines they weren't supposed to cross. She wrote about the anger she had carried, the entitlement she had disguised as duty, and the way she had trained herself to view discomfort as a threat when it came from someone who looked like Obadiah. Her words were not eloquent, but they were not empty either. She said she was entering a racial equity rehabilitation program, not because of public pressure, but because her world had crumbled, and for the first time, she wanted to build something new from the rubble. She had lost everything: her job, her credentials, her professional standing. But in that loss, she had finally seen what she had never allowed herself to see before: the humanity of the people she had dismissed. She ended the letter not with a plea, but with a sentence that stayed with him. If silence can be powerful, then maybe listening can be redemptive. Obadiah did not respond, not out of pride. He had nothing left to prove. Her awakening, late as it came, was not his responsibility to complete. He placed the letter in the drawer with others: notes from former passengers who had witnessed the flight, messages from junior crew members who had quietly resigned, statements from strangers who had recognized something familiar in his experience. It was never about the individual acts. It was about the larger silence, the collective shrinking away from discomfort, the systems that protected the lie instead of questioning the story. But here, in a quiet act of reflection, Darla had chosen not to run from the truth. And in that there was meaning. Falcon Jet's new leadership, desperate to restore its credibility, announced a sweeping overhaul of its training programs, including a partnership with Obadiah's foundation. It was a move that came not from PR necessity, but from deeper pressure, government stipulations, internal revolt, and a reckoning from investors who had seen billions evaporate because no one had the courage to ask one question in flight: what if we're wrong? Obadiah was offered the chance to lead the internal ethics reforms himself. He declined the official title, but agreed to consult quietly, methodically, on one condition: that the changes be structural, not symbolic. No banners, no vague commitments, just accountability, just action. And in time, that's what happened. Flight crews were retrained, internal reporting systems were rebuilt, and for the first time, the company began tracking reports of bias with transparency. The transformation wasn't perfect, but it was real. Tina, the young flight attendant who had once looked away, began working with Obadiah's team. She became the voice for others inside the aviation industry, people afraid to speak, people stuck between job security and moral clarity. She testified at oversight hearings. She helped write protocols to protect passengers and crew from retaliation when they reported unethical behavior. She had once signed a lie under pressure. Now she helped dismantle the culture that made lying easier than truth. Her journey didn't erase her mistakes, but it gave them purpose. Obadiah continued his work, traveling between cities, reviewing infrastructure plans, advising governments, mentoring new leaders. But something inside him had shifted. He had spent decades avoiding visibility, navigating the power corridors quietly, believing that to be effective was to be unobtrusive. But Flight 379 had changed that. It taught him that visibility wasn't always about ego. Sometimes visibility was a shield for others who couldn't speak, who wouldn't be believed, who were one accusation away from erasure. He didn't seek the spotlight, but he stopped hiding from it. He gave lectures now, not about contracts or aerospace logistics, but about justice in everyday places: airports, offices, elevators, places where power hides in uniforms and clipped voices, where cruelty is disguised as policy, where the difference between respect and humiliation is often just who's watching. Years later, when asked in a quiet interview, his first and only one, what justice felt like, he answered without hesitation: justice is not revenge. Justice is repair. And repair only happens when the people who caused harm are willing to rebuild what they broke, even when no one is watching. That quote ended up etched on a plaque inside the Falcon Jet Ethics Training Center, installed next to a framed image of an aircraft wing touching the edge of a sunrise. Not because of Obadiah's status, but because the people inside that building needed a daily reminder that systems are only as fair as the people who run them. Darla Keene, years into her rehabilitation work, now volunteered as a program facilitator for bias deconstruction workshops. She didn't lead, she listened. She told her story not as a cautionary tale, but as evidence that change, though painful, was possible. She had destroyed her career, but in that destruction, she had discovered that her value as a human being was not irretrievable. She was not forgiven in headlines. She was not excused. But she was doing the work, and those who attended her sessions didn't come to applaud. They came to unlearn. They came to change. Obadiah received another letter from her, this time short, simple. It said, "I understand better now. Thank you for not silencing me, even when you had every right to." He folded it quietly, placed it beside the first, not because it absolved her, but because it reminded him that stories didn't have to end in punishment. They could end in reflection. They could end in understanding. They could end in a different kind of peace. And so the story of Flight 379, once a private humiliation intended to isolate and erase, became something else entirely. A warning, a turning point, a parable for how injustice thrives in the space between perception and truth, and how even the smallest act of listening can begin the long road back toward dignity. Obadiah Lane never looked for recognition. He only asked that those with power use it responsibly. In the end, the villains didn't just fall. They changed. They suffered. And then some of them rebuilt. The ending wasn't about triumph. It was about truth. Because justice, when it's real, doesn't end with applause. It ends with clarity, with change, and with the quiet courage to be better next time, before someone else has to suffer for it. The end. If this story moved you or made you think, consider liking and subscribing to stay updated on future episodes and narratives. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about the plot? Which part hit the hardest? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Your feedback helps shape what comes next. Let's keep the conversation going.